Hello again. Last week we had a week of answers to the various questions that had been sent in. Today I want to do something that's related in a way. We're back to our one-off longer talks, so this one will be a bit more than the 10 or 20 minutes that those supposedly short answers usually turned into. And this time we're going to look at a broad question that, in a sense, I've summed up in the title, is were Roman soldiers nice? Although that does sound a little bit camp and rather dubious in the way. Essentially, it comes back to the sort of question that historians and archaeologists have been talking about for years, and that often come up during debates in conferences. And it's really, you put it down to situations like this. If you're a civilian within the Roman Empire, and you're walking along the road, whether it's out in the country, let alone in a town, and you see one or more Roman soldiers coming towards you off duty, doesn't necessarily mean that they're all tooled up with their equipment. The argument is, do you just walk on and say good morning or go past them, or do you cross to the other side of the street to be as far away from them as possible because you're not quite sure how they're going to behave? And it comes back to broader questions about just what the Roman Empire was like, what it meant to be alive then, and not simply as someone from one of the provincial populations where you've been conquered by the Romans and you may have this sense of the Romans as imperialist oppressors, occupying forces, this sort of thing, but also for civilian Romans. So really it's this question of how far were Roman soldiers a privileged section within the community, that they were able to exploit that position and use it to mistreat others, civilians, particularly those who were not well connected, and behave as they liked, get the benefit of being men with swords, men with weapons, men who represent the imperial system, and who have better connections to that government than certainly the poorer citizens elsewhere? Or are we looking more at a force of people who are themselves one of the exploited groups? Roman soldiers get paid, but they don't really get paid a lot. If you end up being promoted, if you end up being of senior rank, yes, it's a very good life. However, the wage for a legionary, the daily wage, is slightly less than that of a skilled agricultural labourer. It's comparable with an unskilled one, though it's not always as good as that. It depends on the area and the time. But it's also, you have the advantage, obviously, as the soldier, is that pay is regular. You're guaranteed it isn't seasonal. If you're working on the land, there will be times of year when it might be harder to get any employment at all. The soldier knows he's promised by the emperor, it's part of that bond, he takes an oath to the emperor, and the emperor promises to give him these regular instalments of pay. Now, we'll look at other times, there's a fair bit of evidence to suggest that now and then you didn't get your pay on time. Unsurprisingly, that's happened often enough in organisations and armies throughout history, but at least in theory you should get them on a day you're expecting to get it, and you are going to get it regularly. And while yes, you'll have deductions made for various things, nevertheless you're guaranteed that. You're guaranteed, when not on campaign, a roof over your head. You're guaranteed a level of medical support, of services that are there because you're a soldier that you wouldn't necessarily get if you were poor and a civilian, whether Roman citizen or not. These are not people from the very top of society in the main. Again, officers are an exception to that. On the other hand, alongside that guarantee, that protection, that food, you're paid for your food, you have to pay for your food, you have to pay for your clothes, all these things. Lots of things deducted from your pay, but nevertheless you get them. You are guaranteed these things. And as long as you play your part and behave as a soldier should, then you'll be honourably discharged if you're wounded or invalided out in any other way. Yes, you won't get treated so well if you desert, if you run off, but basically speaking, there's a contract between you and the state, or you and the emperor. But as part of that contract, you also sacrifice a lot. So the discipline within the army is extremely brutal. You can be executed, you can be flogged, beaten with sticks, you can be deducted, obviously, pay and all sorts of other things like that, and denied privileges like leave and this sort of thing. So we'll come on to a lot of these aspects as we go along. There are sacrifices that a soldier makes legally, for at least the period from sometime in Augustus's reign through to the early 3rd century. Then you can't contract a legal marriage. You're allowed to make a will, even if your father's alive, whereas technically in Roman law, if you're a citizen, your father owns everything until he dies and then you get it, but you're allowed to make a will, and you're allowed to make a will less formally than it would be permissible for civilians. So Hadrian, for instance, brings in a rule that soldiers who have told their comrades that they were bequeathing this property to somebody, that will count as sufficient witnesses to validate the thing. Again, with these rulings by emperors, you're never quite sure how easy it was to have the law enforced. So you're dealing with soldiers who've, in many cases, had families. They've got their woman, their wife as far as they're concerned, but the woman with whom they live. They may well have children, and they want to pass on property to those individuals when, legally speaking, they can't marry. Therefore, these people can't legally be heirs. And in some cases as well, if you're a legionary and you've taken a local woman, then what's the legal status? She hasn't got citizenship, this sort of thing. Auxiliary diplomas, as we've mentioned before, this document you have granting you Roman citizenship and proof of this at the end of your normally 25 years military service, that also granted citizenship to a wife, only one. You weren't allowed to marry several and get it for all of them, and the children with that wife. That was stipulated. That clause tends to fall off later in the 2nd century, but it's there for a long time. So there are advantages and disadvantages of being a soldier. It can be a pretty tough life, and that's even before the inherent dangers of being a soldier, in that you might have to go to war, you might get killed, you might get maimed, you might die from fever disease on campaign because conditions will be difficult. You've got broader questions. We'll talk about how frequent warfare might be, but there is a danger when we approach a topic like this of looking at it simplistically. So you can have the Roman soldier as hero, the sort of square-jawed character, looks marvellous in illustrations, who defends the empire, like the 2nd century AD orator Aelius Aristides described the army as walls around a city. Effectively, they guarded the empire like the walls around a city. You're a hero, you're depicted this way on monuments like Trajan's Column, you're muscular, you're tough, you're overcoming anything the enemy can throw at you, the weather can throw at you. You can chop down a forest and build a road, you can capture a walled city, you can fight all sorts of wild barbarians in battle and win and come through this. So you have the soldier as hero, but you can flip that completely and turn the soldier into the petty tyrant, the soldier into the stormtrooper, the instrument of a repressive, evil empire who is brutal, repressive himself because that's the way he's treated, that's the way he responds, and he simply exploits what little power he has as being a minor representative of that empire to lord it over anyone else, to mistreat anyone else. There's evidence for both of those within the sources and the information we've got in sheer logic, and we should be careful, as with modern society, that we're not too simplistic. So, I tend to think of Kipling, the single men in barracks don't grow into plaster saints. Yes, there's the Roman soldier. There's we have almost the heroic version in our image we get very often from the reenactment societies. Movies will go one way or the other. You can have the heroic Roman soldier, you can have the Roman soldier as automaton. He's basically a mindless machine that gets sent forward whilst our major characters do things. Or the soldier as monster, cruel, vindictive, rapacious. You'd look at any modern society and look at depictions of soldiers, of police officers is another one. Think of the number of TV dramas, films where you have the heroic cop of one sort or another, and it might turn into the sort of Dirty Harry model, or you can have the corrupt police officer, the one who's taking bribes, the one who's faking evidence, the one who's setting people up. Sometimes these are stories based on real events, but more often than not they're fiction, and the fiction can be told in different ways. So you can depict the same group of people as good or bad, or you can also be more subtle where you have individuals who are good, bad, some are corrupt, some are not. Excuse me, all right, Gussie, you can go out through the door. There was a scraping sound, you could hear that was Gussie just trying to open the door but not making too much of an effort from it, and then looking up, expecting to go out. So he's gone off in search of water or food. So it isn't simple, and we could be too apt to jump upon a stereotype that we happen to like. So Oh, there's Gussie joining in at that moment. Obviously, he doesn't like that comment. In the same way that you can have the movie that depicts the how do you see resistance movements against an empire, against an army, against a country? Are they the terrorists? Are they resistance freedom fighters? Are they the heroes? It really depends on your perspective. And yes, there will be certain cases where you can look and say, yes, the behaviour of this group is pretty nasty. Or actually, in the circumstances, that's nowhere near as bad as some. You have to try and judge everything by the standards of the time. But also, is the source that's presenting these people in a particularly glowing, wonderful way, or in a particularly hostile way, is that a source we can trust, or is that very much a point of view? You would get... thinking back to the troubles in Ulster, Northern Ireland, your view of the British Army, of the constabulary, would depend, and then you've got the view of the different paramilitary groups. It's going to depend on which political perspective you come from, and your direct experience as well. If you get caught up in violence inflicted by one of these groups, then inevitably you're not going to think well of them. On the other hand, if that group is seen as a shield or protector, you'll think differently. And, everyone tends to forget that in the early days when the British Army went into Northern Ireland, they were there to protect the Catholic communities against violence from Protestant paramilitaries. So there was an initial positive view of them that very quickly changed to a hostile one as Provisional IRA's campaign took off and all this sort of thing. Very complicated, but from the distance, if we were judging little fragments of evidence from 2,000 years later, we might not understand those nuances. So you have to be very, very careful with all of this. And let's come back to Kipling again, and just a reminder that it's, in a sense, it's easy to pick on soldiers, particularly from a comfortable perspective of wealthy Westerners who don't have to worry too much about law and order, who are fairly safe, and who might not necessarily be the sort of people to join the military or serve in the military, that the people who are the heroes in wartime can become the near vagabond criminals of peacetime, or the thugs, as far as you're concerned, and yet they're the same people doing the same job. So let's have a bit of Kipling, because there's never not a good time to read some Kipling. So, from obviously his famous Tommy Atkins poem, "We aren't no thin-red heroes, nor we aren't no blackguards too, but single men in barracks most remarkable like you. And if sometimes our conduct isn't all your fancy paints, why single men in barracks don't grow into plaster saints. While it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy fall behind, but it's pleased to walk in front, sir, when there's trouble in the wind. There's trouble in the wind, my boys, there's trouble in the wind. Oh, it's pleased to walk in front, sir, when there's trouble in the wind." What have you got the other line there with... making mock of uniforms that guard you in your sleep is cheaper than their uniforms and their starvation sheep. Curiously enough, I'll be back to doing the videos on the HBO Rome series at some point, but I remember having a really interesting chat with Kenneth Branham, who played Pompey in that when we were working on that BBC Supersizers programme, because he'd just been doing a show of Kipling's poems, and it was really interesting. He'd looked at the music hall tradition and the sense of music and rhythm and how it affected the way Kipling wrote the words and how that was memorable. But I never got to see the show, unfortunately, which is great because I suspect it was rather good. Again, one of those actors with such a great voice. But that's just a reminder. That's Victorian, early Edwardian perception of the British Army as beggars in red, that only the vagrants, only those who couldn't find a job elsewhere, only the unemployables would end up enlisting in the army because the pay was so bad and it was really dangerous and you got treated really badly. But also how the newspapers would then, when there was a news of a victory from Africa or India or wherever, would be celebrating how wonderful our fellows in red were and how marvellous it was, songs like Soldier of the Queen and that sort of thing. Societies can have these contradictions in that you can see the same group as heroes sometimes, but you can also treat them very badly and be rather disdainful towards them the rest of the time. But the point is, these are the same people. So let's try and get behind the masks of the Roman soldiers. And sorry for the pun, but I happen to find this picture of German reenactors doing a thing at Karl Kreiser, I think, with helmets with face masks. And there is that problem. You look at a sculpture of a man depicted on his tombstone, even more the the heroic proportions of the figures on something like Trajan's column, the column of Marcus Aurelius with its more artistic approach, the slightly more blunt and brutal look of Adam Clissie. And again, we're talking about the same people, and the probability is that we're not going to be able to answer a question like this simply and say, yes, the soldiers were all wonderful people, they were pure, they were noble, they were guardians of the state, they were heroic, they laid down their lives to defend everybody else. There's some truth in that. But the other stereotype of, no, they're all, semi-criminals who've been saved from banditry by joining the army. This gives them an income, but it allows them to go and oppress everybody, and they're vicious, and they pick on anyone, and they're anyway representatives of this brutal oppression that is the Roman Empire. Truth is unlikely to be anywhere near as stark as either of those alternatives. It will be far more complicated. And we have to remember that the Roman Empire is there for a very long time. There are lots of different regions, attitudes to being in the empire, the experience of being in the empire, and the experience of contact with Roman soldiers will be very, very different. So while we find evidence that suggests particular points of view, we have to try and think of the wider picture, put this into context. You've even got, for instance, if you go to the New Testament and the Gospels, where you have questions asked to John the Baptist, and one of them is by soldiers. Now, these people are probably from the army of one of the Herods, rather than necessarily part of the prefect procurator's regular Roman troops in Judea. But again, go to those videos, the Pontius Pilate's bodyguard one and the shorter one about the crucifixion. There is a lot of blurring of lines between troops that are regular auxiliaries and troops that are organised in the same way, equipped the same way, trained the same way, possibly commanded by Romans or Roman-trained people who served client kings and client monarchs within the Roman Empire. And at times will end up being transferred into the Roman army and then transferred back to the control of a client king, and then eventually most of the troops that had served under the Herods and the units that had been there end up as regular auxilia. And you could think of parallels with British India in the 19th century, particularly before 1857, where you had a company army, which is quite a strange concept in the first place, but you would have most of India was actually ruled by the princely states, by the Maharajas, because the East India Company wasn't capable and to some extent wasn't interested in administering everywhere. It was there for the money, basically. It does other things and extends to other things, but that's the reason for its existence in the first place. But you have armies loyal to and organised by and paid by these various princely states, some of them wholly independent and doing things in a traditional way or whichever way the local authorities decided. But you'd have, say, I think the Gwalior contingent, people like that, who were essentially British-style regiments with British officers attached to them, just as the ordinary East India Company regiments were done in the presidencies. But they were loyal to and serving an independent, at least in theory, local leader. So those sorts of confusions get on. And here we're probably talking about men who are not strictly speaking Roman soldiers, but whatever your feelings about the wider context of the Gospels, the New Testament, they are useful as, in a sense, a worm's eye view of what it was like to be in the Roman Empire and some of the things that concern people, some of the attitudes people have, the way things are done. So here you have from Luke's Gospel, and the soldiers likewise demanded of him, saying, and what shall we do? And he, that's John the Baptist, said unto them, do violence to no man, neither accuse any falsely, and be content with your wages. So basically, don't abuse power. Don't beat people up. Don't intimidate them. Don't make false accusations, and be content with your wages. You've got similar sort of admonitions to other groups. So the people are told to be generous to the poor, the publicans, publicani, exact no more than that which is appointed you. There are questions. If you're a representative of the state, you are allowed to commandeer things at certain times. There's another one of the parables talks about, if man compels you to go a distance, go further with him. The sort of people likely to be compelling you to do things might well be Roman soldiers, or soldiers like this of a princely state, a client kingdom. that look to you pretty much like Roman soldiers and are recruited from the same sorts of groups that will end up in the Roman army. So that's suggesting from the start two things. One is the obvious negative one. This is something that ordinary people are worried about, the feeling that these abuses are far too common and that they are abuses. This is not how the soldiers of the kingdom of the empire should behave. They shouldn't be roughing people up who don't deserve it. They shouldn't be demanding more money than they're actually due in their pay. They shouldn't be lying about people, making false accusations, bearing false witness, all this sort of thing. So you have two sides to the coin. On the one hand, you could say, well, this is clear evidence suggesting that these abuses are common. So soldiers out there are doing bad stuff that they shouldn't be doing. On the other hand, you can also say that within society there is at least a belief that they shouldn't do these things. That the good course of action that John the Baptist is advising them to follow is actually, you take your wages and nothing more. You don't abuse your power. You don't pick on people. You don't bear false witness. You're sort of true and strong and you do your duty. So in a sense, it's evidence for both sides of the coin, not a simple, oh yeah, Roman soldiers are terrible, or people like Roman soldiers are terrible, they're abusive, they exploit their position. What it's saying is that some of them might, but that's not the ideal, and the theory is that even some of the ones who might can be persuaded that they shouldn't do that. Now, might be a little bit naive, but nevertheless, it's representing an assumption, an ideal of how you should behave, and a reality that some at least are not living up to that. Now, obviously, the most dangerous thing for a Roman soldier is going to be battle. Disease is quite a risk as well. When you think if you live in a Roman fort, it's fairly crowded. It's no coincidence that during the 2nd century plagues that follow Lucius Verus's campaigns in Parthia, and then spread throughout the empire and seem to be brought back by contingents of troops coming back from that war, that the highest levels of fatalities are in the cities and the army camps. Because in a sense, army camps are rather like small towns or cities. You put a lot of people in close proximity with each other. Now, one of the shorter questions that we'll answer soon is just how clean the Romans were and how hygienic things were. But even with the best one in the world, even when you do have bathing facilities, you do have sewers, toilets, this sort of thing, you're still putting lots of people together, and epidemics will spread where there are enough people to be infected. They can't do so otherwise. So life can be dangerous. There's a chance of accidents while training, whilst working. Often Roman soldiers are carrying out major labouring construction projects. There's an element of danger inevitably in those sorts of things. We come across in one of the unit rosters, there's a man who's drowned in a river. I remember years ago talking to somebody who'd been a paratrooper in the US Army in Vietnam and done his whole tour there, and the only fatality his platoon suffered rather than wounded was a man who was eaten by a crocodile. You get, obviously that was in a harsh environment, particularly extreme one, but then plenty of Roman troops would be operating in rather harsh environments by the standards of the day. So there's a lot of risks, but battle is obviously the bigger one. Now, obviously, your chances of being involved in a battle, let alone suffering injury, harm during it, will depend a lot on where you are, what unit you're serving in, the level of conflict that's going on in that province, or that troops from that province may be taken away as a vexillation, as a detachment to go off and serve somewhere else. So, I have 4 now, and I can flash them up again. There's a tombstone, or at least a family monument from Caelia Enisca Silorum, base of 2nd Augusta, that commemorates a son who was defunctus in an expeditione Germanica, died in an expedition to Germany. Whether that's killed in combat, whether that dies of disease, accident, we don't know. So the Roman soldiers could fight, and they risked death in that respect. Though again, there were probably some people who went through 25 years, never saw any real combat situation at all, particularly in the start of a major war. Others would see a lot. It's, you know, like a lot of these things, it's very much a matter of chance. Your enthusiasm as well. You know, there are probably people who can find a cushy billet somewhere in a base somewhere that requires that they can't possibly be moved anywhere, and others that are volunteering for everything and trying to get into the action, successfully or not. And of course, from the point of view of the individual, doesn't really matter if you're killed or wounded in a major battle or in a tiny skirmish involving a handful of people and fighting against bandits, fighting against raiders, whatever it might be. You know, it's just as important, just as critical to your life as the famous event. Now, we all know, and I'll talk about this on other occasions, that Roman warfare could be extremely brutal. Roman tactics are very aggressive. You know, the basic equipment of a legionary or an auxiliary is heavy armour to protect you when you get close, and after throwing something at him, you close in, buffet him, bash him with your shield, and then try to thrust and possibly cut, and, you know, stab him in the stomach, stab him in the face, do all of these sorts of things, push on, and then kill the enemy when you've got them on the run, because that's the easiest time to do it, and if you can punish them badly, then you probably won't have to fight them another time. So Roman warfare obviously is brutal, and campaigns can end up with mass executions, mass crucifixions. You know, there's talk, Josephus describes legionaries outside Jerusalem in AD 70 getting bored with the long siege and crucifying prisoners in odd postures that they found amusing. You know, pretty grim stuff. You get cases on Trajan's column of headhunting. Whilst it's mainly depicted as auxiliaries doing this, you also see a couple of heads on stakes next to some legionaries digging a position. So maybe, I mean, it's primarily, there's a reference in the Spanish War, the account of the 45 BC campaign at Munda, of Roman legionaries putting up the severed heads of dead enemies that they've killed, and these are fellow Romans. So at times things could be very brutal, and this runs through. Ancient warfare tended to be pretty nasty, and the Romans were efficient, very good at winning, and one of the methods they used to that was the organised atrocity. Make fighting the Romans, the price of fighting them, so awful that people would be willing to give in, come to terms, because they just can't face this. So let's go back very early, and this is the citizen army, the militia army of the Second Punic War and that era, when Roman soldiers then are men of status and property. So this is not the people drifting into the army, the only ones will still join. But in Polybius talks about Scipio when he's taken New Carthage, modern day Cartagena, in 210 BC. When Scipio thought that a sufficient number of troops had entered, he sent most of them, as is the Roman custom, against the inhabitants of the city, with orders to kill all they encountered, sparing none, and not starting to pillage until the signal was given. They do this, I think, to inspire terror, so that when towns are taken by the Romans, one may often see not only the corpses of human beings, but dogs cut in half, the dismembered limbs of other animals, and on this occasion such scenes were very many, owing to the numbers of those in the place. Now, Polybius wasn't there in 210 BC, but he did accompany the Roman army in the siege of Carthage. He saw the sack of Carthage and was probably with Scipio Aemilianus in Spain as well later on. So some of this are things he's seen. Now, if you go back to the Conquered and the Proud series, where we look at Roman imperialism, passages like this were used by the school that became quite fashionable in the late 70s and 80s, that saw the Romans as exceptionally brutal, exceptionally violent, that this constant conscripting of men to go off and fight in the army and do massive violence to Rome's enemies brutalised them. And it's the sort of post-Vietnam shadow, the My Lai massacre, all this sort of thing, where academics in universities who were in a political environment that, generally speaking, was highly critical of the war while it was going on, and certainly afterwards, they are presenting a very negative view. And it goes back to that, I think I probably mentioned this before, but when I was growing up, virtually every police show or film that came from America, and we saw over here, the criminals were 90% of the time seemed to be Vietnam veterans, you know, these poor kids who'd gone off to war and come back as these ruthless killers and all this sort of thing. And it was a terrible cliche, caricature. You're getting it sometimes nowadays as well. It's starting to come out a little bit, particularly if, you know, sort of the directors or the writers are wearing their politics on their sleeves, and where army veterans or marine veterans are suddenly seen as threats to society because they've just become killers and nothing more, and all this sort of thing. They've lost their sense of morality, and it's a gross misrepresentation, and a very ungrateful one, given that we're the societies that have voted for the governments that have committed people to war, and then we badmouth them when they get back. So you have to be very careful. And again, but that's clearly an indication where if you come up against the Romans, it can be very nasty. And Roman troops can be very brutal. And as I say, that's not the professional soldiers at this time, although these men had served for quite a few years in the army by the time this happened. Let's go on to a case from the professional army, and this time AD 69 and the sack of Cremona during the civil war that followed from Nero's death. And this is Tacitus' account. 40,000 armed men burst into the town. The number of colones and lixi, that's the different types of camp followers and army-owned slaves, was even greater, and they were more ready to indulge in lust and cruelty. Neither rank nor years protected anyone. Their assailants debauched and killed without distinction. Aged men and women near the end of life, though despised as booty, were dragged off to be the soldiers' sport. Whenever a young woman or a handsome youth fell into their hands, they were torn to pieces by the violent struggles of those who tried to secure them, and this in the end drove the despoilers to kill one another. They carried firebrands in their hands, and when they had secured their loot, in utter wantonness they threw these into the vacant houses and empty temples. For 4 days did Cremona supply food for destruction. This picture shows a sack of a much smaller place than Cremona, just an Iron Age village in the north, but it's the same idea. In the picture we've got Roman soldiers destroying a farmstead lived in by the local tribes in northern Britain. So this is the Romans repressing a rebellion, responding, reprisals against raiding, this sort of thing. In Cremona, you're dealing with a civil war, and you are sacking a town within Italy. Now, the troops that pour in are men who've just fought a very tough battle and suffered heavy casualties, and then had to storm the place against a very active defence. Troops that have stormed into a fortress rarely behave very well when they get inside, and a proportion of them quite often run amok, and the scenes tend to be unpleasant because it's so difficult and dangerous getting into a fortification or a fortified town that you've gone pretty wild and you are pretty angry and you have a lot to avenge. So, think of the British Army in the Peninsular War, Ciudad Rodrigo, Badajoz, San Sebastian. The French sacks of cities were even more brutal, but then the French were, in a sense, invaders, the Spanish were their enemies, whereas the British were allies of the inhabitants of the town, but that didn't protect the poor people who were there. I mean, there were rumours about Badajoz that they'd sided with the French and all this sort of thing. There were excuses, and there are plenty of troops who do not run amok and keep their discipline, but there is a significant proportion that do, and the atrocities are appalling. You could find these similar examples in many, many periods of history. An interesting thing, and it's something that's often claimed in the sources for the Peninsular War and elsewhere as well, where they blame local criminals, basically. It's the same way that when a protest leads to rioting and shops are looted, the people who've organised the protest will usually tell you, possibly with truth, who knows, that it wasn't the organised groups that did this, it was people who are mooching in and realising that there's an opportunity for confusion and they can simply rob. It's the people who would normally be stealing. This is just an extra opportunity. Again, maybe not, but maybe crowds make individuals behave in ways that they wouldn't necessarily do normally. As I say, in Spain there's the idea, it's the same after Waterloo, that it's the locals that come in and start stripping the dead, looting the dead, killing the wounded to finish them off, this sort of thing. Here you've got the blame passed not onto the Roman soldiers but more onto the camp followers. But nevertheless, these are clear examples of Roman troops doing very unpleasant things. Now, a lot of the description with Tacitus, it's a little bit formulaic. It's the sort of thing that you get in many ancient sources. You can trace back to Herodotus, Thucydides in particular, where you have intercommunal violence and leading to atrocities and mistreatment of civilians. Alexander the Great, sack of Thebes and other cities. So there's a pattern, yes. Troops often do behave like that when they've stormed a city, stormed a fortification. And the more difficult the siege has been and the more dangerous it's been, the more likely they are to go pretty wild. And some of them are using it as an opportunity, and some of them have had to get drunk to storm there in the first place, or get drunk soon afterwards. And with the emotional release of all of this, It doesn't justify what happens, but it helps to explain why these patterns of behaviour seem to occur again and again. The same troops don't necessarily behave this way at any time. However, it is interesting that Caesar himself, going back to an earlier civil war, the one in 49 BC, when he's crossed the Rubicon into Italy, at Corfinum, for instance, he will not let his soldiers enter the town in darkness because he doesn't feel he can control them. So, again, that might not be everybody within your unit. It might be that you know there are some who will take advantage, who are the men who will go off and loot and rape and do all the things they shouldn't. And the officers won't be able to control them even if they tried to. Another thing as well, thinking back to Polybius and the sack of New Carthage, do remember there, and I may have pointed this out in the other lecture, that Scipio's orders are for the Roman troops to kill everyone they meet. It isn't to go into the houses, find everybody and kill them. The whole point is you've stormed this city, but there are plenty of cases in attacks on ancient cities where the defenders rally and throw the attackers out again. So having got over the walls, through a breach, whatever it might be, doesn't guarantee that city's going to fall until you take control of the key positions and make sure there is no more organised resistance. So there is an element of practicality about this. You kill everyone to terrorise them. If they know that's what's going to happen, then unless they're determined to fight you, they're going to hide in their cellars, hide out of the way, and they will probably be safe, to the extent that if you are in a captured city, then you're risking enslavement anyway. So, this is the ancient world. It's not a nice place. And while you could say that, you go back and read some of the royal proclamations by various Assyrian kings, the Romans don't quite carry out sadism to that level, but it's still not a nice thing to be in a city captured by the Romans, any more than it was to be in a city captured by the Macedonians or the Spartans or the Athenians on the rare occasions they did take a place, or the Gauls or Germanic tribes or whoever it might be. Warfare in the ancient world tends to be brutal, and that doesn't mean that we should just say to the Romans, oh well, that's fair enough, it doesn't matter that you're not very nice sometimes. It means we put it into context. There aren't really people out there who are behaving much better than this, and some behave worse. Now, let's think, that's the wartime context, but let's think more of a sort of peacetime, the normal situation, because that gives you an idea of what the Roman army's like, whether it's a brutal occupying force, and there are schools of thought that will depict them that way, and the Roman soldiers are fairly nasty. If you want that expressed and well argued, then Ben Isaac's Limits of Empire is a very good book. I think he pushes the case too far, but on the other hand, he raises an awful lot of points that you really do have to consider. We'll deal with that more when we look at the whole grand strategy question, because he's obviously a big player in that debate as well, which I promise I will get onto. I know I've been talking about that for quite a few months now, but I will get around to it, but because it's quite a big topic, I want to be able to deal with it properly. But what about peacetime? When the Romans are storming a city, it's in a war, there is more likely to be violence. You'd expect brutality, killing, because in some shape or form these people can be perceived as enemies or the ones who harboured enemies, and also you have that object lesson element that Polybius emphasised with Scipio, that he says, well, the Romans are trying to terrify people because capturing a walled city is difficult, so they'd much prefer the defenders to give in when you arrive out there and summon them. And that's clearly part of this whole, we talked a little bit about siege warfare and the Persians in the eastern frontier a while back, this tendency that you're trying to persuade the other side to back down, to give in all of the time. But in peacetime, how do Roman troops behave? Now, this is a fragmentary writing tablet from Vindolanda with a letter, a petition to the commander of the garrison. Unfortunately, we haven't got all of it, but it gives us an idea. It starts off, he beat, probably there's somewhere there's question marks. I think that's where the editors have guessed at the reconstruction. So there are some doubts about this text, but the context gives at least a feel for it, and the guesses are pretty shrewd ones. I certainly wouldn't dare to try and improve upon them, because the editors have done an incredible job on the writing tablets. So, he beat me all the more, in goods, or pour them down the drain, possibly. As befits an honest man, I implore your majesty not to allow me, an innocent man, to have been beaten with rods, and my lord, inasmuch as I was unable to complain to the prefect because he was detained by ill health. I have complained in vain to the beneficiarius, that's warrant officer, NCO, expressions like that don't really work in the Roman army, but someone with authority who has the sort of benefit of being on specific duty. They're often outposted on their own. They're a cross between a soldier and a policeman to some extent. With, they're not ordinary soldiers. They've got more status than that. They're not as senior as, say, a centurion. They're in between. And then the rest of the centurions of his unit. So this champ's gone to the beneficiarius, he's gone to the centurions. Accordingly, I implore your mercifulness not to allow me, a man from overseas and an innocent one, about whose good faith you may inquire, to have been bloodied by rods as if I have committed some crime. Now, the assumption is, the editor suggests this, and it seems reasonable, that he's complaining because he's been beaten up by soldiers. Presumably from this garrison, that's why he's gone there, or from another garrison, but he's gone to one where he considers his reception might be more favourable. He's had goods poured away, so his wares have been destroyed, wasted, some may have been taken from him. He's been roughed up. Now, there are lots of things that are said that we would love for more explanation as to just why he's saying that means. So, for instance, he talks about a man from overseas as well as being an innocent one. So, I didn't do anything, I've been roughed up. Is there then an implication that a man from overseas, someone who is not from the island, the province of Britain, would expect to be treated with more respect? Whether he's, he doesn't say he's a citizen, but perhaps he's come from Gaul, from Germany, wherever. But that, I wouldn't be here, I'm not going to be a rebel, I'm not going to be a troublemaker, I'm just an honest trader. That's clearly the mood. But again, it gives you a glimpse of what might be attitudes towards different groups and different levels of privilege within a society, within a province, but not enough for us to say definitely that's what's going on. So he claims that he hasn't committed a crime, he's been beaten up, he's been, he's lost a lot of his livelihood, his wares, all this sort of thing, and that he's gone to the beneficiarius, not had any joy there. He's gone to the centurions of the unit, not had any joy there, and the prefect's away, so can't talk to him. So he's talking to somebody else in authority. Again, it comes from a prefect's archive, so it's either been passed on to him, or he's gone to somebody else, and perhaps he is going to the next garrison along because he hasn't got anywhere with the first one. Now, this could, of course, be we're assuming that troops have done this and not somebody else, members of a civilian community, and he's complaining to the army because he wants the army to go and do something to those authorities or unofficial group or mob or whatever it might be. Assuming that they're soldiers, then again, it comes down to basic common sense in that, on the one hand, this could be a gross miscarriage of justice. This man could have been beaten up, robbed, his stuff destroyed, for no reason whatsoever. Picked on because he's annoyed people, because the soldiers were throwing their weight around, assuming it was soldiers, and he is entirely innocent. On the other hand, it's a little bit like insurance claims. Most of them will be genuine and honest, but lots of people suddenly remember all the, the tapestries and precious metals and expensive things they had in the house that burned down, or the car that was stolen. We don't know. If the man was lying, he would speak like this. If he was telling the truth, he would speak like this. So we don't know, and we don't know what happened. As with so many of these sorts of petitions we get from the Roman world, you have a glimpse of an incident, of personalities, of characters in a place at a time, giving you a sense of life there, but we really don't know the whole truth. So again, go to plenty of court cases. People will tell all sorts of stories that, again, might be true or might not, or will exaggerate, in the hope that their case will be heard and they'll get what they want. So that's a hint, perhaps, we've got of soldiers abusing their power, but we don't know how far to push it. Now, let's move on a little bit. That's nice because that's actually a real document. Somebody wrote this. Again, as I say, we don't know whether the man's telling the truth or lying, or he's exaggerating, expanding on the truth, embellishing it to make it more dramatic, and we don't know what happened to him. If we go to Apuleius, the Golden Ass, which is a novel written under the Principate that has, it's obviously, I suppose you call it fantasy or something now, in that the main character gets turned into a donkey, the Golden Ass, the title, from up to now. But he travels around Roman provinces, Roman towns in sort of Macedonia, Greece, that sort of area, and and talks about day-to-day things. Now, it's obviously a novel. It comes back to the cop shows, police detective series that we talked about earlier. Those sorts of things are heavily stylized. They don't have real life for people doing those jobs tends to be a lot duller. There are far fewer shootouts, fatalities, major corruptions going right up to City Hall, and all the sort of, the stuff. We tell stories about things that are more dramatic than real life, exaggerated versions of real life. On the other hand, it can be an interesting illustration. So this talks about, and again, the narrator is at this stage a donkey, so it's all slightly surreal. But anyway, on the road we encountered a tall man whose dress and manners marked him as a legionary, miles et legione. He inquired in a haughty and arrogant tone where my master was taking his empty ass. But my master, who did not know Latin, walked right past without a word. The soldier, unable to restrain his natural insolence, took offence at the gardener's silence as if it were an insult, and struck at him with the vitis he was carrying, knocking him on the back. It's a quick digression. The vitis is normally the cane associated with the centurion, but there's some evidence from sculptures and elsewhere that soldiers might carry them anyway, and it's a badge of rank, and it probably doesn't literally mean here a centurion or a man of that status. It probably means a soldier who's got his sort of swagger stick out, or his walking stick, or his can be useful as a club, as a stout staff if he needs it. Right, he was knocking him off my back. The gardener humbly answered that he could not understand what the soldier said because he did not know the language. So the soldier responded in Greek. Where, he asked, are you taking that ass of yours? The gardener replied that he was heading for the next city. Well, I need his services, said the other. He must carry our CO's baggage from the nearby fort with all the other pack animals. He immediately laid hands on me, took hold of my lead rope and started to drag me away. But the gardener, wiping away the blood flowing from the wound on his head, caused by the earlier blow, again pleaded with his fellow soldier, commilitonem, to behave more civilly and mercifully, begging and adjuring him in the name of the soldier's hopes for success. So, again, we'll go on, there's more to this story, but this is interesting because you've got the soldier that addresses the gardener presumably in Latin first, then switches to Greek once it's clear that the man doesn't understand. He's wanting to confiscate this donkey to claiming it's to carry the commander's baggage, his officer's baggage. So it's this man, the servant, or just on the escort or whatever, or somebody more senior who's passing through the area. Now again, that goes back to the biblical, don't take more than you're asked for. Than you have a right to take. Accusations of requisitioning more than you have the right to have they're fairly common, so it's quite interesting. Now, the gardener claims the donkey is aggressive and weak. The soldier continues, starts using the knobbed end of his vitis of his cane. Pretending that he wished to touch the soldier's knees to arouse pity, the gardener stooped down, bent over, grabbed both his feet, lifted him high in the air and dashed him heavily to the ground. Then he began to pound him on the face and hands and sides with his fist, elbows, teeth, and even a rock grabbed from the road. Once the soldier had been thrown on the ground, he was unable to fight back. But he kept threatening the gardener that if he ever got on his feet, he would hack him to pieces with his machaira. That's Greek for sword. Warned by these words, the gardener snatched away the soldier's sword, it uses the word spatha, and threw it away. The soldier pretends to be dead to avoid further beating. The gardener takes the sword, asks the friend to hide him. Soldier appears in town looking as if he's had a terrible hangover and can barely walk. Tells no one until he meets some other soldiers. They decided that he should hide out for a time in their quarters since, besides his personal disgrace, the loss of his sword made him fear the protecting deity of his military oath. So it's an interesting sidelight where you've got this fellow runs into some other soldiers who hide him because you've just been roughed up by a gardener. That's not what your properly trained fighting man that as a soldier you're supposed to be. That's not how things should happen. That's obviously embarrassing. But he's also lost his sword. Now, while you get deductions for equipment and this sort of thing, obviously a soldier who's lost his sword, that's a big, big deal. And talks about his military oath, he's supposed to look after his equipment. In the daily reports from Vinlander and elsewhere, you have this statement that sort of all the men and all the equipment is in the right place, is where it should be. Anyway, the soldiers then, together as a group, look for the gardener and the donkey. A neighbour informs the gardener and his protector, the man who's sheltering him. The soldiers go to the city magistrate. They alleged that they had lost a valuable silver pitcher of their commander's along the road, and that the gardener had found it but refused to give it back. Backed by the authorities, the house is searched. The soldiers repeatedly swear in the name of the emperor that they speak the truth. The donkeys found, the gardeners seized and taken away by the authorities for punishment. Again, think back to the don't bear false witness, back in the bit from the Gospel we looked at the beginning. Basically, they're claiming that they were entirely in the right, that they have just, something had been lost, the gardener picked it up, wouldn't give it back, and then this is the story they tell the magistrate of the town. So it's not to a military authority, it's to the civil authority, and we're Roman soldiers, we're backing each other up, you're just a gardener, some peasant, who cares what you think. And then a bit later on, the soldier sells the donkey for 11 denarii and goes to Rome to carry a letter to the emperor on the orders of his tribune. So presumably the tribune is the officer who's been referred to at various times. This is a man on detached duty. He could be one of these groups that are like the frumentari that get involved in particular carrying of dispatches. They have an unfortunate reputation. They eventually become a sort of secret police force, but that's for another video, another day. Or it might simply be that he's the man in the unit being dispatched to do this because he's sort of, attached on the staff and that's his job. So the whole thing is interesting because it reflects the sort of misbehaviour that we've had referenced elsewhere. But again, think back to that petition from Vindelander of the man claiming he's been beating up. As I say, he might be telling the truth, but he might be lying just like the soldiers are presented as lying in the novel here. There is also, when soldiers are not closely supervised, when they're not present with their unit, then discipline is likely to be laxer because there is nobody looking over their shoulder. There is no one with rank and authority who knows what they're doing in such a specific way. So that the chances of abuse would in many respects appear to be more likely for individual small groups that are off on detached service rather than troops that are in barracks in a camp, because then there is the formal system of military discipline, the hierarchy, and they've got lots of more organised duties. There's somebody keeping an eye on them, there are far more witnesses. It will be much harder for them to do something like this and get away with it. So it would be much harder in the environment of a camp, or even when you were just present with most of your unit, for somebody to go off, effectively by law steal a donkey and then that you claim you need for your officer, and then flog the donkey, pocket the money, 11 denarii is not a vast sum, and go off and continue about your duty because somebody would be watching. And again, this then leads on to the question as well, what level of behaviour did senior authorities expect from the soldiers, and how strict or not would they be? There's an interesting case when Cicero's in Cilicia in 51 BC. He discovers that the previous governor of the province had been extorting money from the towns and cities of the area by threatening to billet troops on them. Now, partly that might be a reaction of, well, that's going to cost them money because they might be obliged to provide the food and accommodation, all this sort of thing. But it may also be that the legions there were not particularly well disciplined, that this is going to cause trouble, and you've got a lot to deal with. Anyway, let's stick with fiction for the moment and consider an incident from Petronius' Satyricon. So this is written in the days of Nero, really. And then we won't go into full detail about this, but again, it's one of our characters comes across a soldier. So, with these words, I put on my sword, recruited my strength with a square meal to prevent my losing the battle through weakness. I rushed out the doors at once and ran round all the arcades like a madman. My face was of one dumbfounded with fury. I thought of nothing but blood and slaughter, and kept putting my hand to the sword hilt that I had consecrated to the work. Then a soldier, who may have been a swindler or a footpad, so the idea is you can't tell whether this man is a soldier or not, noticed me and said, "Hello, comrade, what regiment and company do you belong to?" I lied stoutly about my captain and my regiment, my centurion and my cohort, and he said, "Well, do soldiers in your force walk about in white shoes?" My expression and my trembling showed that I had lied, and he ordered me to hand over my arms and look out for myself. So I was not only robbed, but my revenge was nipped in the bud. I went back to the inn, and by degrees my courage cooled, and I began to bless my footpad's effrontery. So this was someone who was about to go off to fight, a young man who, if you read Satyricon, these are not really people that you you would trust with sharp objects or running with scissors or anything like that. They're a pretty sort of dubious set of individuals, loafing around, mooching off people and telling pretty unpleasant stories as a rule. It's a very sort of decadent book in many respects. Interesting, but it's what survives of it anyway is greatly exaggerated, like the Feast of Trimalchio, the freedman, that time and again you see people will cite as an example of this is what a Roman feast was like, this is what the Romans ate. No, it's satire. It's meant to be ridiculous and over the top. Let's look more broadly, because Juvenal, who had served, he'd had an equestrian military career, so he'd served in command of auxiliary units, may have been a tribune of a legion as well. And at the turn of the 1st, 2nd centuries, one of his satire 16, was about the army. Sadly, only a small part of it has actually survived, because it would have been interesting to see what sort of things he thought were worth mocking, what he thought was funny. So, we've got this. Gallius, who can count up the benefits of a successful career in the army? Let us discuss first the benefits shared by all soldiers, of which not the least is that no civilian would dare to beat you up, and if he gets a thrashing he will conceal it and will not dare to show the praetor his teeth which have been knocked out, and the black lumps and swelling bruises on his face, and his one remaining eye for which the doctor holds out little hope. If a man seeks to gain redress for this, he's granted a military judge in hobnail boots and hefty jurors sitting on mighty benches, in accordance with the ancient law of the military camps and the practice of Camillus, that a soldier may not be involved in litigation outside the wall of the camp and far from the military standards. Again, probably an exaggeration, but this is a satirical work. It's meant to make people laugh and shock them. It isn't a documentary. And then a bit more. Of course, the judgment of the centurions in the case of soldiers is extremely just, and I'm certain to obtain retribution if I lodge a legitimate complaint. But the whole unit is against you, and all the soldiers unite in complete agreement to make sure that your retribution is something that needs medical treatment and is worse than the original offence. You could more easily find the dishonest witness who will speak out against a civilian than one prepared to tell the truth against the interests and honour of a soldier. Well-earned approval brings promotion and confers the right rewards on distinguished service. It is indeed in the interest of the commander to ensure that brave men are also the most satisfied, that they are all happy with their military decorations and medals, and so on. As I say, sadly, the rest is lost, or at least the bulk of the thing is gone. It would have been very interesting to have this. As I say, Juvenal is a former soldier himself, or a former middle-ranking to senior officer, battalion commander equivalent, something, staff officer at the tribune stage. So, in one sense, but he is also a member of the elite. He's of this well-educated literary circle that are senators, that are equestrians, the very wealthy, and whilst they are quite happy to praise commanders, senior officers like themselves, they often have barely concealed contempt for the ordinary soldiers. Now, Tacitus will write about the Emperor Tiberius complaining that in Italy the only people who joined the legions were basically the criminals and the vagabonds, people who just couldn't find work anywhere else. Nobody else would do it. Because again, you could probably get a much better and certainly much safer job and much easier job. Soldiers had to go through a lot. Military service was tough. Even if you weren't actually fighting a war, and there was always a chance that you would be, and perhaps quite a few of them. But there's a lot of, you're being ordered around, you're being made to do things, you've got to work, you've got to slog, you've got to march, you're made to do things when you're tired, you're chased around, you can get punished. So they tend to ignore all of that, and then they focus on, obviously, the encounters with soldiers where it's in a civil war. And obviously a civil war is a bad time for everyone, and when armies do run amok, obviously that's bad. When armies overthrow an emperor and appoint their own commander as emperor, that's another bad thing. So there is a literary stereotype of sort of brutal, licentious soldiery, unreliable, they're ignorant. Tacitus has a case where an eclipse frightens them all during a mutiny in Germany in AD 14 after the death of Augustus. They can be fooled by things. They don't think. It's a lot of the stereotypes that are reserved for poor people, for barbarians, for everyone who is not an educated, elite, aristocratic Roman of this literary circle, and for some of the people even within that they don't particularly like. So you have these stereotypes of soldiers that means that in the sort of the high literary sources, the proper literature of the period, very often when they're not actually fighting and winning battles, you're getting very close to the Kipling, Tommy Atkins thing, where soldiers are dismissed as thugs, as brutal, as greedy. You know, they're happy to be bribed by their commanders to gain their support, and then they'll overthrow anybody, as abusing their power. But of course, it's all a question of perspective, and these are exaggerated. Doesn't mean they're not true. It just means that there's more to it than this. This is not the whole story. So let's go again to something that is more direct evidence, and rather like the Vindlander tablets, we've got a papyrus from Egypt that dates to 31 AD. This is to Quintus Gaius Passer, centurion, from Hermon, son of Demetrius, near the village of Tais in the toparchy of Thomostho, and I can't pronounce that properly, of the Oxyrhynchite nome. I own a plot of land inherited from my paternal grandfather called Of the Woodland, in which there is a public dyke and a cistern, which is situated in the middle of my land, along with so many cubic measures and other things. For all of these I pay the appropriate taxes, but I am being attacked and plundered by the fishermen Pausus, Papsios and his brother, and Cales, Milas, Atinus, Pazois, and their accomplices, not few in number. They also brought along Titius the soldier, and approaching my cistern with many fishing lines and scaling knives, they fished with gaffs and pulled out fish worth 1 silver talent. Moreover, when I remonstrated with them, they came up to me apparently intending to, again, the bit's missing, this is not censorship, this is simply the papyrus is missing a word, do something unpleasant to him, obviously. Since they are using force against me in many ways, I am taking recourse to you, and I request, if you agree, that you have the accused brought before me so that they may pay me back for the value of the fish, as was mentioned above, and so that in the future they may keep away from my property in order that I may be assisted. Farewell, year 17 of Tiberius Caesar Augustus, on the month, day and month. Now here you've got an interesting situation where this is a man who's basically complaining about people who are poaching fish from his a pond on his land, and it's my land, I pay the taxes, everything's legitimate from my point of view, and they've brought along with them, not only threatened him, but they brought along a soldier has come with them who's helped them threaten them. They've pulled this stuff out, they've eaten his fish, they haven't paid him for him. So here again we have a case of an individual soldier behaving badly, breaking the rules. He's not the instigator of all this, he's simply joined in with a group of local rowdies, enemies, thugs, whatever you might be. People who, for whatever reason, either just want the fish and are happy to steal it or don't like the man involved. But are all known to him. He names each one of them, he names the soldier as well. But he goes to another soldier, or an officer, the centurion, to complain about this. Now this is one of many papyri from Egypt, often sent to a man who's a centuria regionarius, a regional centurion of the sort I've used in my novels, complaining about a problem. Someone has attacked me, my husband has gone missing, I've been robbed, and expecting redress, where the soldier or the officer becomes the representative of the authorities, of the empire, of the state, and a crime has been committed against me, please do something about it. In this case he's asking for basically payment. They've stolen this stuff, they've eaten my fish, I want to be paid for it, and I obviously implications will prefer it not to happen in the future. I don't want them to get away with it. So here you have clear cases where individuals feel that by going to the army, in this case a centurion, other cases it might be a beneficiarius when he's at a way station along a road, perhaps even an individual soldier, but there are cases from the Red Sea outposts where you've got individuals at quite a low level, so probably again you're going to them as the man on the spot. And a reasonable expectation to make it worthwhile you're attempting this approach that they will actually do something. They will uphold the law, even when it means upholding the law against not just some local thieves, but also a soldier. One problem is that these documents nearly always survive, like the one from Vindlander, in isolation. We don't get the whole story, so we don't know what the centurion did about this. We know that a complaint was made, we have the copy of it. But we don't know what action was taken, if any, whether the centurion ignored it, said, well, I don't care, it's a soldier, I'll let him do what he likes, or these people have already, they've been treating me to a fish or whatever, I don't know. Or does he go in, investigate the matter, find out the truth, act against them, arrest people, and rightly or wrongly punish the culprits or the lawbreakers, whether or not, at every stage this is done properly, whether he acts as we would expect in modern society, the authorities, the police to act, or whether you still see him. It would seem odd. Clearly there is at least some hope from the point of view of this man that this complaint is worth making. Some action might be taken, but we don't know whether it was or not. On the other hand, if we go to Roman law, this is the digest compiled by Ulpian. He talks about how the governor of the province must ensure that persons of humble means are not subjected to injustice by having their solitary light or meagre furniture taken away for the use of others, under the pretext of the arrival of officials or soldiers. The governor of the province should ensure that nothing is done in the name of the soldiers by certain individuals unjustly claiming advantage for themselves, which does not relate to the communal benefit of the army as a whole. So again, you do have a clear statement of the ideal presented by law that is in a digest of laws compiled on behalf of the emperor, that governors are supposed to stop abuses of authority and power and corruption by officials, but particularly soldiers. So soldiers confiscating things, whether it's the donkey in Apuleius, whether it's anything else. And he talks about furniture, their light, taking their lamp. These sorts of things, you're not supposed to do this. Yes, there are obligations on communities that when a detachment of troops comes through, when an emissary of the envoy comes through, let alone the governor or the imperial household, that you are obliged as locals to help provide for them. But there are, again, stipulations as to how much can be reasonably expected. There's an interesting story in one of the rabbinic texts that implies that the Bar Kokhba rebellion almost starts with some soldiers trying to steal chickens and being roughed up by villagers who own the chickens. Again, remember the things the Romans do, the Roman army does. You've got the road building, so the ability of people to travel, to trade, to do all of these things runs along the back, really, of the military road system and the imperial road system that improves communications, initially for strategic reasons and for the movement of men and particularly supplies to feed the army. It's very often these roads are built by the army and they're sometimes maintained by them. Lots of other public works are built by the army. So again, it comes back to this idea that there certainly is an official view that soldiers should not misbehave, and that certain behaviour, certain actions like confiscating things to which they're not entitled, beating people up, bearing false witness, are bad things that they shouldn't do. So it's the acceptance that, yes, these things happen, but they shouldn't happen, and that rather implies they probably don't happen all the time. So judging the frequency is very difficult, because obviously breaches of any rule, of any law, tend to jump out more than everybody obeying them, and nothing in particular happening. Let's go on from this. So you get soldiers detached on duty, another papyrus, this time from the 130s AD, and it's Marcus Petronius Mamertinus, prefect of Egypt, declares, I have been informed that many of the soldiers, while travelling through the country without a certificate, requisition boats, animals and persons beyond what is proper, on some occasions appropriating them by force, on others getting them from the strategoi, literally means generals, but it's actually the local officials in the village areas of Egypt, by exercise of favour or deference. Because of this, private persons are subjected to arrogance and abuse, and the army has come to be censored for greed and injustice. I therefore order the strategoi and royal secretaries to furnish to absolutely no one any travel facilities at all without a certificate. So here's somebody trying to do something about the problem, but it also acknowledges that there is a serious problem. So again, you come to this balance as to what's normal. What do you get away with on an everyday basis, and how much does the state actually stop? But at least it does show you that the state tries to, at the very least pays lip service, and probably more, this seems to be concrete action, that you're trying to restrict this. But in the same way you hear about bribes being paid to centurions to get preferential treatment, it doesn't seem to be something that can be stamped out altogether, but it isn't universal either. It's somewhere in between. And here we go. Here we've got testimony in favour of a soldier from AD 37. Village secretary, swear by Tiberius Caesar, the new Augustus, emperor, son of divine Zeus the liberator Augustus, that I know nothing of anyone being subjected to extortion in the vicinity of the above-mentioned villages by the soldier and his associates. If I swear truthfully, may things go well for me, but if untruthfully, the opposite. Now, obviously, again, we're coming back to our sort of cop show thing where who's going to testify against the mob, sort of thing. So you could argue this is someone, well, you've got a soldier there who's abusing his authority, but he's so frightened everybody that no one's going to say anything about it to the authorities because they're far more afraid of him than they are of being caught bearing false witness. It could be that, but it could also be that genuinely this soldier has been maligned by someone and people are saying, no, he's a really good bloke, he follows the rules, does everything, and I'm speaking up for this. Again, we just have the evidence, this incident, and you can read it in whichever way you want to, really. But soldiers clearly are involved. They can confiscate things. They're also involved at checkpoints on roads, at forts. Somewhere like Hadrian's Wall is really, in some respects, some people would argue that's its main purpose, is a whole long row of checkpoints at the mile castles, at the gates, where to pass through, you have to go through military scrutiny. Now, again, one of the arguments about mile castles is that they cause a problem because there's such a small number of soldiers there, you can't keep a close eye on them. That's maybe why the gates there are decommissioned and everybody has to go through the fort, because it's perhaps a little bit harder to get away with things unless you've got the complicity of the more senior officers there. I mean, there's a case of units on, I think it's the Rhineland, that are accused of sending troops on hunting expeditions to get furs and feathers and things like that they can sell off on the market as a nice little earner for the officers involved. So you get, again, hints of abuses, but that these are seen as abuses highlights the fact that there are rules and that at least some, perhaps even most, follow those rules most of the time. There's an attempt to regulate what soldiers are doing. And also that there's self-regulation by the soldiers. There's a sense of their military honour, of their proper behaviour. They've taken an oath, they're under discipline. How they should behave will affect their reputation. In any institution, there are plenty of people who don't break the rules, as well as the ones who steal office supplies or hire their chums for jobs and all this sort of thing if nobody's watching them too closely. And you do find cases where communities actually want a military presence. So, again, in AD 213, the consulship of the Emperor Antoninus for the third time, and Caelius Balbinus, 11th of October, at Prymnesus, the procurator, Philocurius, they are showing dissension in respect of matters that have been decided. Those who are showing dissension shall be punished in accordance with the decisions. Valens. The Anosenae request that they should be granted a soldier on police duty. Philocurius, the procurator, to guarantee the decisions I shall provide a soldier. So this is the case, it's an ongoing dispute in this area where a community has said, could you put a soldier here because he can actually enforce the rules? These are your judgments. Like anything else, it's all very well passing a law saying this should happen, or telling people this is how they should do things, but if you don't check on them, who's to know whether that actually is followed through? So a soldier can be a good thing. A soldier can be seen by a civil community as someone who's advantageous to have around, because again, he represents the state and the empire, and perhaps individually he's big and tough and knows how to use a sword as well, but nevertheless he's there. He also is able to send reports directly to authorities that can go up the hierarchy to someone ever more senior and eventually get to the governor of the province. Let's look at another case where a community wants a military presence. So this is from Pliny when he's governor of Bithynia in the early 2nd century AD, and it's Pliny to Emperor Trajan. You have acted with great wisdom, sir, in issuing instructions to Calpurnius Macer, distinguished man, to send, that's the governor of one of the military provinces of Moesia, the other side of the European side of the Dardanelles, to Byzantium. Consider if you think that we ought to look after the interests of the people of Juliopolis in the same way. This community, although very small, bears extremely heavy burdens and suffers more severe injustices precisely because of its comparative weakness. Whatever help you give to the people of Juliopolis will be of benefit to the whole province, for they are situated at the head of the route into Bithynia and put up with countless people travelling through the town. So there's a case. Pliny's citing an example of a town that's got a centurion stationed there to help regulate people passing through the traffic, all this sort of thing, and keep order there. Because again, it's a bit like the theme of plenty of westerns. You get the group of cowhands coming through. They can shoot up the town and are drunk because they're celebrating at the end of a cattle drive, and then they move off somewhere, and it's difficult for the local authorities to find them or do anything about them. With travellers, there's always that element. Locally, like the man in Egypt who's had his fish being poached, he claims to know the people responsible and gives all their names. But if it's a stranger, who is he? How do you catch him? In this case, Pliny is asking for another similar military presence, preferably a centurion or an officer in another city. I can't remember off the top of my head. I don't think he actually gets it. There's a lot of resistance in this. It's something we'll look at when we look at how soldiers serve on detachments and as little outposts and this sort of thing. That Trajan keeps saying, I want as many people with their proper units as we can possibly manage, but then keeps making exceptions. Oh, actually, yeah, it makes sense to have a small detachment here or an individual there or somebody to guard the procurator while he goes about his duty. So there are two sides to it. There are cases where communities want soldiers there, particularly officers, men of considerable authority like centurions, but often individual soldiers, like the case before, just somebody who will act on behalf of the state and try and enforce the rules and the law. Now, again, you could argue, obviously, the people who are asking this might be the elite within that community that feel that they will be in a stronger position because they can, in effect, crack the whip of the state. They can threaten people with the power of the state in a way that they couldn't normally do because they'll be the one who's brought the man here and he's more likely to listen to them than anybody else. But it doesn't have to be like that. It can be more... It comes down to a basic thing of, do you see a Roman outpost when it's next to a village or a farm in Britain or elsewhere, when it's present in a town in one of the other provinces? Do you see it as more of a modern police station that, yes, there will be some people in the community very suspicious of them, perhaps for the reason that their activities will likely to draw the police attention, or they feel that the police represent some authority that doesn't favour them or even represses them. There'll be plenty others that see this as a reassuring presence. It is someone who will keep the rules, prevent me from being mugged, attacked, all this sort of thing. Just from knowing there are soldiers here, from the archaeological remains of a site, we simply don't know. We don't know how people viewed it, and the odds are it runs the whole gamut of different interpretations. There's two things you've got to remember. Again, come back to this point. The army is still there as a fighting force, and these soldiers can be called upon to do very difficult, dangerous things and suffer the consequences. They live under a tough training regime, a tough disciplinary regime. Although, like any army in any time, it will be tougher and harsher in some situations than in others, and in some cases than others. There will be units with tight discipline that behave themselves. There will be units that are very good at fighting but not necessarily so well disciplined when it comes to the quieter times. They're in a sense overtrained, and you've recruited the sort of aggressive individualistic types that sometimes will get a little bit out of hand, but you can manage it. Or it can be the unit that's completely out of hand, that isn't necessarily that well disciplined or prepared for its military role either. And you can get the ones that are underfunded, neglected. You've basically dumped the people you don't want anywhere else on this one outpost to get rid of them, and they're not supervised. They are simply, left to their own devices. And if nobody checks on what they're doing, and if no one in the local community is able to be listened to by authority or is able to complain to authority, then they can abuse. So lots of possibilities are there. Remember as well that these are troops that are recruited from the population, though again, recruitment tends to go to particular areas more than others. So by the latter part of the 1st century, it's very rare for anyone to join the army if they come from Italy. And if they do, they tend to go to the Praetorian Guard or the urban cohorts, something like that. Newly raised legions sometimes will be raised in Italy, so they'll have a sort of first generation of Italian recruits. But you get far more people from North Africa, from southern Gaul, from Spain, from military colonies everywhere, from certain provinces. And the auxilia, again, have recruitment patterns that we'll talk about in more detail another time. But one thing that's quite interesting is that it's hard to tell the soldiers apart after their military service in, say, the villages of Egypt. People who've been in the army seem to rub shoulders with their neighbours, former neighbours, just like anybody else. Many of the auxiliaries were recruited from the communities. They might be posted away, but there is a tendency to recruit from the easiest source. And as time goes by, you really aren't worried about internal rebellion too much in most of the provinces, because that nationalistic sense, if it existed at all, is long since gone. So you will find Britons serving in auxiliary units in Britain, for instance. Not necessarily in the territory of their own tribe, so that's a big deal, but nevertheless within the province. And many of the other recruits are coming from the Rhineland, from, again, the easiest place to go off, send a recruiting party and find some likely lads who are willing to sign up for a mere 25 years and join a unit. Soldiers can be concentrated in major bases, but they can also be outposted, whether it's in watchtowers, fortlets, this sort of thing. They're obviously concentrated in the main on the frontier zones, but within that area people are being detached. Many of the big towns and cities within the provinces don't see organised formed bodies, full units, but on the other hand they'll see individual soldiers passing through on public duty, acting as escort. The emperor doesn't have a very large body of people outside the army that he can tell what to do and send off on missions. So soldiers do find themselves doing an awful lot of different things. This is something we'll deal with in another video called something like "What Does a Roman Soldier Do All Day?" Which I've been thinking about, and I'll put together at some point when I get a moment, to try and look at just what does it mean to be a soldier. How much action are you likely to see? What's the day-to-day routine like? What's the training regime like? What's the other tasks you're going to be called upon to do? What sort of leave do you get? What's the experience in general? So we'll look at that at some point. Really, there's the whole gamut of different views of what Roman soldiers were like, and so much depends on the source you're dealing with. So that I haven't pushed a particular line. I suspect that it just varied a lot, that there were cases of abuse by Roman troops, but there were plenty of cases where the troops didn't do that. On the whole, in spite of aristocratic prejudice, you still feel there is a reasonably favourable view of the Roman army and Roman soldiers. And also, if you look at the culture of the military themselves, there is clearly great emphasis on status as a soldier that you can see in the inscriptions people set up, particularly their monuments, their funerary monuments, but also the emphasis on belonging to a particular unit. So I suspect that, like any good army, on the whole they behave reasonably well, because there is a sense of honour, and there's also the tight discipline. It doesn't mean they're perfect, doesn't mean they're plaster saints or anything like that, doesn't mean they don't go wild sometimes, doesn't mean that some do not abuse their power, but on the whole the army works because it is a fairly efficient body, and generally speaking efficient bodies tend to have rules and be well regulated and well led, and also encourage that sense of pride that you are a Roman soldier, therefore a certain level of behaviour is expected of you. Because in the end you've got to persuade these people to go out and risk their lives and die on your behalf and protect the other communities. So perhaps I'm biased, perhaps because, particularly as I've written novels about the Roman army, and you wouldn't want to depict them all as monsters, because who would want to read a novel like that? I've tried to show them warts and all, that they're not perfect, that there are abuses, but also that there is a reasonable case can be made that actually if you saw a Roman soldier coming down the street, you didn't automatically cross to the other side of the road. It depended who you were, where you were, and it depended what you knew of him. But that you weren't simply frightened of soldiers. Perhaps that would be the case in recently conquered and occupied territories, where they're very much seen as a hostile outside force oppressing you. And you can see that view in some of the Jewish sources. There's, for instance, a commentary on Deuteronomy that's probably second, maybe early 3rd century AD, that clearly does not look favourably on the Roman Empire and its representatives. So these are the oppressors who have taken hold of the land of Israel. But tomorrow Israel inherits their property, and they will enjoy it as oil and honey. Curds from the herd, these are their consulars and governors. Fat of the lambs, these are their tribunes. And rams, these are their centurions. Herds of Bashan, these are their beneficiarii, again these senior soldiers on special service away from the units, who take away food from between the teeth. And goats, these are their senators. With the finest of the wheat, these are their women. So you'll get views of the Roman army that are hostile. And you can, again, we'll come on to this when we look at strategy, when we look at life within the provinces, you can paint a picture of an oppressed population seeing the Roman soldiers as their oppressors and being frightened of them. These are brutal men who will abuse their power. On the other hand, you have to be a little bit careful because these sources come from a particular point of view. And again, it goes back to reporting in an area now of the world that's dominated by paramilitaries or militias. You won't tend to find many locals criticising them, and they might well criticise intervening forces from another power or the UN or anything like that, because you know you can get away with that. You would sometimes find that, again, everybody involved in some of these paramilitary struggles will criticise the official authorities, because it's easier to do that. One of the things, if you go and criticise the paramilitaries that run your area, they know where you live, and they know where your children play, and they know everything about you, in a way, to a degree that the authorities don't tend to. So they are often a lot more scary than an army can ever be. Which of course doesn't mean that armies aren't necessarily, or in some circumstances, scary, and then they might not be oppressive. So it isn't simple. If there's a moral within this, it's that you can actually present Roman soldiers in several different ways. You can present them as protectors, defenders, good, beneficial policemen to at least some of the population in some areas. And you can depict them as rapacious, bullies, and sometimes cowards, as you have them in the fiction, where the gardener beats up tricks the one soldier and roughs him up, and the soldier is just out for quick profits. Sees a donkey, sees that the man riding him looks like some peasant who doesn't matter. I can pick on him. It comes down to, we'll look at banditry and other things like that in another time. On the whole, the empire works. Now, if you want to, you can believe that it works for all these centuries because the military just scares people. And there's going to be an element of truth to that. It certainly deters rebellion, but there are other things that deter rebellion as well and encourage. There are lots of reasons why people don't rebel and why the empire does succeed for so long, and people want to be Roman. Now again, this is not an equal society. You've got slaves, you've got the very poor who are not necessarily getting their slice of the cake from being within the Roman Empire, but a significant proportion of people in every province do benefit from this, feel content with this, at least decide that it's preferable to any alternative. Now, the army is not ever present. It is in some areas, it is in the frontier zones, it seems to be a presence in many of the big cities in Syria, for instance, at least at certain periods. Some provinces have to have very large garrisons. It is hard to explain, with the evidence we have, why there are so many troops in Britain, at least until about the middle of the 3rd century AD. The garrison of Judea will steadily increase. Obviously after the rebellion, before then it's just had auxiliary troops. It gets a whole legion plus auxiliaries afterwards, and by the next century it'll end up as a 2-legion province. Now that's partly to do with internal rebellion, but also you have to think, well, the army is being deployed so that it can be used for other purposes as well. It's also being deployed because emperors aren't quite sure how much they can trust provincial governors with how large an army they can let them have. The behaviour of the individual soldier is right at the sort of the opposite end of the scale to that. But it is still one of those things. What we can say fairly clearly is that the state does at least make a show of caring how its troops behave. So it doesn't want soldiers running amok. They are not simply given license to do whatever they like. Now, that may be for the practical reason that obviously if you do that, then you're going to provoke rebellion because everyone will just get so fed up they'll eventually turn against you. More importantly, you've also got the argument that if you just let your soldiers behave like that, in the end, they're probably not going to be very good disciplined soldiers. And there is less and less chance that they're going to be as efficient as you need them to be in any particular project. And you don't want, when you say, all right, I want the army to go and help build a basilica here, or put a bridge over this river, build the roads there. You don't want massive corruption and incompetence doing that. You'd like it to be done reasonably efficiently. And there is perception that you see reflected in Pliny that military engineers are the best around, and that they're the ones you want if you want a task completed and actually achieved. So the army is a very big institution. There will be the rotten apples, there will be the winked upon assumptions that, perhaps juveniles right and soldiers did always stick together. They did always, their officers indulged them over the civilians. But it's going to depend, it's going to vary, it's going to be more complicated than that. So I would say, this is probably the moral in many of my videos on these things and the answers to these sorts of broader questions, it isn't as simple as they're nice or nasty, or they're honourable, well-disciplined, well-behaved, or they're brutal and repressive and corrupt. There are examples of all of those things. But on the whole, the army does its job well enough so that it's efficient at doing its job, but also it does not alienate people. The army isn't really big enough to hold down the entire empire by force. The population is much, much larger if they turned on them. And of course, your population are the people you rely upon to recruit into the army. So although compared to the elite, there is a sense of the army as a sort of separate group that lives on the frontiers, you have this in Tacitus where he talks about soldiers arriving in Rome in AD 68 during the Civil War, seeming very barbarian to the inhabitants, because again, Italians aren't joining the army by then. He doesn't seem to distinguish between auxiliaries and legionaries. It's just all the soldiers seem foreign, seem brutal. And they probably are different, and they are coming, they're professional soldiers. They are, for much of their life, they're part of a separate community to the rest of the population in a way that the old militia army of the 3rd century BC, 2nd century BC was not. On the other hand, it's also very clear that many soldiers do not cut themselves off from their families, from their home communities. We have letters of people writing home. We have suggestions within the auxiliaries that, you might well be looking after your extended family, either by sending them money or even by bringing them to where you're stationed. And you go back to those areas and you settle back there. So these are not people who go off and cut themselves off in the same way you can see the people in Egypt mingling with society. They go off, they join the army, they serve, they come back. So it's obviously dangerous always to assume that what you expect from your own society is what you will see in the Roman society. There are some elements of that. There are probably other elements where things are very different, but I think we're taking on the aristocratic prejudice against soldiers if we see soldiers as purely this sort of brutal, repressive force. So I think some of them were sometimes, but actually most of them were not most of the time, and some behaved even better than that. So they're going to run the whole gamut of human behaviour. But on the whole, the Roman army maintains fairly high standards of discipline for much of its existence. And one aspect of this is not engaging in sort of freelance violence. Basically, they go off and they fight, and they will do things when you tell them to do it, but they're not going to just do it on their own. And they're not going to abuse too often because, again, it's not good for the system. It's not good for their discipline. So, as I say, come back to the soldier walking towards us down the street and, well, we'll think about it, but we'll see what he looks like and his attitude is. And of course, if we're someone of considerable status, then we can probably be very confident that he's not going to dare do anything to us. The examples that we get from the stories and elsewhere all seem to occur in isolation. When you meet a soldier and there's nobody else around other than perhaps him and his cronies, that might be a danger. But there again, you could see, you meet anybody in a dark alleyway and you don't know who they are. And the ones that are, again, the times when they do misbehave will make a much better story that will be repeated than the 100 other times when they don't. So take some parallels from modern life, from more recent periods. Be aware that Roman society is different, the Roman system is different, but don't simplify. Don't do a caricature of the Roman soldiers are all saints or the Roman soldiers are all monsters. They're a mixture. But again, there is a structure. The ideal is certainly that they behave themselves. As with many ideals, as with many laws, as with many codes of behaviour, not everybody lives up to that all the time. But anyway, there we go. That's were Roman soldiers nice? If I go back to that rather corny title at the end. That's it for today. I think probably next week or perhaps the one afterwards, we'll do another week of answers to questions, the shorter ones, just to keep going with that, because that seems to have worked quite well and created a lot of interest. So I'll do my best to work through all the ones that I feel I can answer in reasonably short videos, and before too long we'll put out another appeal for more if there's any out there. But let's go with this for today. So anyway, thanks for watching today. Bye.